Just to introduce Kristen, Kristen Ghodsee, she's currently the professor of Russian and Eastern European Studies in the University of Pennsylvania. And I suppose she is best known to many people here as the author of Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, which is a book examining in much broader terms than the title suggests the lives of women living under socialism and many of the different implications of that. And she's also the author of Red Hangover, which is a broader look at, I suppose, everyday life and everyday memories and recollections of life under communism in Eastern Europe. And generally, I suppose she looks at the study of everyday life under socialism, and in particular, the gendered effects of post-Cold War and Cold War Europe. So we wanted to ask her along today, not because she's in our political party or anything like that, but because many of us find that she presents or she attempts to present an accurate view of life under communism and memories of life under communism, which often differs a lot from, I suppose, the received wisdom that we might have received in secondary school or wherever. So we're really glad to have her here and to take advantage of the fact that more people are happy to do things online at the moment, to be able to host her. So Kristen, thanks a million, and I'll hand over you to begin your talk.
Great. Okay. So thanks a lot for the invitation. I know that it's been really hard in quarantine to do all these things, but I guess, you know, there's some silver lining that I get to sit here in my house in Philadelphia and talk to people in Ireland. So I'm just going to jump right in. And I'm trying to squeeze in a whole lot of history into a very short presentation. So I'm going to go pretty fast, but I'm perfectly happy to elaborate on any of the material that I cover in the question and answer period. So please throw your questions into chat, and hopefully we'll have enough time at the end where I can sort of elaborate on some of the points that I'm going to make. So I just want to start by saying that I've been doing research, ethnographic research in Eastern Europe really since the 1990s. I was first in Eastern Europe in 1990, right after the Berlin Wall fell. And I've spent really the last 25 years studying the lived effects of communism and post-communism in Eastern Europe. And I definitely, you know, identify myself as a socialist feminist. And so I think that it's really important to understand that socialist feminism has a really, really long history. I myself have been teaching a class in the United States called Sex and Socialism since 2002, so for about the last 18 years. And so the material that I'm going to cover in this very brief talk is sort of an entire semester-long class that I would teach at university in about 40 minutes. So, you know, I'm not going to be able to go into every single detail as I would like. So, but it's important to understand, and I'm sure many of the people who are watching this are probably familiar with the idea that capitalism also depends very much on women's domestic labor. And that's really sort of the crux of the talk that I'm going to give today, is about how it is that socialists imagine creating a better world, particularly European socialists, starting in the early to mid 19th century, thinking about the ways in which capitalism exploits women's domestic labor, or the unpaid work that women do in the home. All right, so before I start, and I don't think that this is necessary for this audience in particular, but certainly for more general audiences, when I speak about socialist feminism, I always have to make a really important distinction between equality versus equity. And I love this sort of a graphic that I have up here. So equality on the first line, as you can see, is giving everybody the exact same bicycle. And different people have different needs because of their different body shapes or their abilities. And so equity means giving everybody in society the bicycle that they need in order to enjoy riding a bike, or in order to be able to ride the bike. And one of the things that gets really confusing for feminists is this distinction between what the socialists called bourgeois feminism, or what is often called liberal feminism, and socialist feminism or left feminism, where liberal feminists generally tend to focus on the issue of equality, wanting to have men and women have the same bike. And socialist feminists or left feminists generally tend to think about equity, which is, given that people have different needs, how can we create social policies that will give everybody the same opportunities to enjoy riding a bike, which might mean giving people different bikes. And I think that's a really important distinction, and it will make a lot more sense as we go through and talk about the lived experience of women under socialism in Eastern Europe, particularly with regard to some of the negatives of the policies that I'm going to be talking about. So I like to start when I teach classes about socialist feminism with Flora Tristan. She is not often considered in socialist literature because she was a utopian socialist and she had sort of a messianic complex. But she wrote this really important book called Promenades Around London in 1840. And in this book, she said, in a society where nothing is free, everything has a price, it is above all women who become objects of exchange. And Tristan really sort of presages the work that Engels later does in The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and Estate. And there's some evidence that, in fact, she had a direct result on him, although he never really acknowledged her. So Tristan is really important, primarily because of this book that she wrote in 1843 called The Workers' Union. And in this book, she argues that workers and women have to work together in order to free themselves from oppression. It's sort of the first time in European socialist history that the idea that women's emancipation and workers' emancipation go hand in hand, that those things cannot be separated. And she says that men and women are different. She acknowledges that women have different roles to play in society because of their role of being mothers. But she says that they're equally deserving of justice. This is a very early articulation of an idea that you will see gets developed much later. And what's really important about Tristan is that this book is really very important because it starts to reimagine what socialism could look like if workers and women work together in order to emancipate themselves, in order to free themselves from the shackles of the property owning classes. And she is, she's been largely forgotten, but Marx and Engels were both in Paris around the time that she was writing, and she had a salon, and they were aware of her work. And so I think it's really important to understand that these ideas travel in different ways around Europe, and the histories of socialism that we're often taught tend to ignore some of the utopian socialists, but particularly the women, particularly people like Flora Tristan. And she's a really key figure because she had some pretty radical things to say about the relationship between women and capital really early on, before it was articulated by anyone else within socialist circles in Europe. And that brings me to August Bebel. Now, August Bebel is a German socialist. He was a pen pal, a correspondent of Engels, and he's probably one of the most lucid continental European theorists of the relationship between women and capitalism. And he wrote this really important book in 1879 called Women in Socialism. And this book, he was an incredibly important figure because he was one of the co-founders of the German Social Democratic Party. And he was elected to the Reichstag in 1871. When the anti-socialist laws were in effect between 1878 and 1890, he was jailed for 4 years. And while he was in prison, he wrote this book, Women in Socialism. And by 1912, the Social Democratic Party of Germany had won 35% of male voters and had become the strongest political organization in Germany. He was like a hero of the German working classes. People sent postcards of him. There's all sorts of wonderful kind of factoids that I could tell you about the impact and the importance of Bebel as a social theorist. Unfortunately, he died in 1913, before World War I. I should say World War I, not World War II. But he had a huge impact on the way that people imagine the relationship between women and workers. And this is particularly important because this book, which was hugely influential. We forget about it now because very few of us actually read it in the original. But you can see that between 1879 and 1914, the year after his death, Women in Socialism was published in over 50 editions and translated into over 20 languages. The first English edition was published in 1908. And unlike other men in the labor movement who believed that women were potential rivals to working class men, Bebel believed that women were equals to men and should have the same economic, social, and political rights and duties. And I'm just going to show you. So this is the German version from 1879. You can see here, oh, let's see, I got to get this to work. Let's see there. So you can see on the left here is the Spanish version. That one's from 1906. There's a French version. I don't think this one has a date, but I think it's around 1905. And then on the next slide, this is the Bulgarian version. It was published, I actually found this in the library, and it was published in Bulgarian in 1893. So it was actually being translated into Bulgarian before it made it into English. And this is a lovely picture of a Bulgarian ladies Marxist reading group from 1912. So you can see here, these are a group of women. They're sitting around with their books and a portrait of Marx. And these are women who would have been reading these texts and actually discussing these texts. So when we think about the history of socialist feminism, we have to understand that there were these early socialist thinkers that were hugely influential on the way that people were conceptualizing the relationship between women and the working class. All right, so what did Bebel want? And so Bebel has a lot of policies, and I can't go into any great detail in this lecture, but obviously he wanted suffrage for women. He wanted them to have equal rights for education, equal rights to the professions. He also wanted property rights for women. These are all things that bourgeois feminists also were arguing for at the same time. But he also wanted to give women the right to initiate divorce. He wanted to give women the freedom to dress as they like, to get rid of all sartorial regulations on women's presentation, which is pretty radical at the time. He also wanted women to have sex whenever they liked, to give them full autonomy over their bodies, which was, as you can imagine, very scandalous at the time. And he was in favor of the abolition of all calculation in marriage. So this is a quote from Bebel. I have to keep moving my, in order to see my slides, I've got to move the little Zoom window. So the woman of the future society is socially and economically independent. She is no longer subjected to even a vestige of domination or exploitation. She is free and on par with man and mistress of her destiny. In choosing the object of her love, woman, like man, is free and unhampered. She woos or is woos and enters into a union from no other considerations other than her own inclinations. So this is 1879. This is extremely progressive literature. And it's coming from a man, and it's coming from a man with an incredible amount of political and theoretical power within the German socialist movement. Around the same time, there was another woman named Lily Braun, who was also a German social democrat, and she wrote a really important book in 1901 called Die Frauenfrage, or The Woman Question. And in this book, she argues that states need to provide maternity insurance for women's workers, which means that there should be a collective tax on all workers that would then go into like a maternity insurance fund to help support women, working women who are having children and raising children. She also argued that in addition to that, women should be raising their children collectively rather than individually raising them in the nuclear family. Again, a fairly radical thing to suggest in 1901 during the Victorian era. Also important is the German Clara Zetkin. Now, she disagreed with she disagreed with Lily Braun because Braun thought that women should sort of form kind of local communes to raise their children collectively, and Zetkin believed that the state should be in charge of organizing kindergartens and creches. But she clearly articulated this idea that women need socialism in order to be equal with men because they need the state to support women's roles as mothers. The state should support, through some form of taxation or collective ownership of the means of production, maternity leaves and kindergartens. Now, all of these ideas, there are lots of socialist feminists around Europe, and they all come together in 1910 for the Second International Congress of Socialist Women, which is held in Copenhagen. And Clara Zetkin is there, the Russian named Alexandra Kollontai, who I'll talk about in a minute, is there. Lots of women from around the continent are in Copenhagen in Denmark, and they're talking about creating a platform for socialism and women's emancipation. And they come up with a series of policies, a series of policy recommendations, largely based on the work of Tristan and Bebel and people like Engels, that then become a kind of blueprint document that gets implemented first in the Soviet Union, later in Eastern Europe after the Second World War, and then beyond that, as socialist ideas begin to move out into the so-called third world or the developing world or the global south, places like Cuba and Vietnam, those ideas get translated there as well. They also come to the West through left parties. So another thing is that Clara Zetkin has a newspaper in Germany called Die Gleichheit, which is the equality. And these ideas that were passed in Copenhagen in 1910 also become popularized through this newspaper, which is specifically advocating for sort of socialist policies to help women workers combine their work-family balance. So now we're talking about Alexandra Kollontai. Alexandra Kollontai was born in 1872. She's an incredibly important figure in the story that I'm going to tell, because she really is the person who kind of takes the theories that people like Tristan and Bebel and Engels and Zetkin have kind of developed, and Lily Braun, and she puts them into practice in the Soviet Union after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, when she becomes the Commissar of Social Welfare. So Kollontai says, it is only in revolutionary struggle against the capitalists of every country, and only in union with the working women and men of the world, that we will achieve a new and brighter future, the socialist brotherhood of the workers. So again, you can see Kollontai here is making this argument that in order for socialism to work, women and workers have to work together. You cannot have independent women's movements and independent socialist movements or workers' movements. They need to be joined together. She is also what some might consider a bit of a sex radical, in the same way she was very heavily influenced by August Bebel and his book Women in Socialism. And she also argues very clearly, again, along the lines of Tristan, that women become objects of exchange in a society where everything has a price. So she says, as regards sexual relations, communist morality demands, first of all, an end to all relations based on financial or other economic considerations. The buying and selling of caresses destroys the sense of equality between the sexes, and thus undermines the basis of solidarity without which communist society cannot exist. And this is from 1921. So this is a very early articulation, again, within the context of the world's first worker state, that women need socialism in order to truly be autonomous, fully realized individuals. All right, let's get to the next slide. Okay, so as I said, she becomes the Commissar of Social Welfare in 1917, and she is sort of flanked by two other very powerful women, Inessa Armand and Nadezhda Krupskaya. Inessa Armand was the head of the Moscow Soviet, and Krupskaya was the Deputy Commissar of Education and Enlightenment. She was also Lenin's wife. She was extremely influential, and the three of them worked together on this newspaper Rabotnica, which was a women's newspaper very similar to Die Gleichheit in Germany. And they were also very involved in this organization called the Genotdel, which I'll talk about in a second. So what does Kollontai actually do in the 1920s? Well, the first thing she does a civil ceremony. She also spends a lot of time trying to create public cafeterias, laundries, mending cooperatives, and children's homes or kindergartens. And in 1920, I'll talk about this in more detail later, is that the Soviet Union becomes the first country in the world to liberalize abortion on demand in the first trimester. And of course, you have the mass incorporation of women into the labor force. So this is the Genotdel. This was an organization that existed for a brief period of time in the 1920s. Inessa Armand was involved, as was Kollontai. And this was sort of a women's section, that's what it literally means, within the Communist Party to agitate and actually try to try to get all of these policies to be funded by the Central Committee, to sort of funnel resources towards women's radicalization and also towards supporting these efforts to socialize domestic work and support women in their ability to get education and eventually join the labor force. All right, I'm going to go into much greater detail in a bit, but just a quick sort of note here. Stalin reverses almost all of these policies in 1936. And between 1936 and Stalin's death, there is, for the most part, a pretty bleak legal landscape in the Soviet Union. I have a colleague, Anna Krylova, who's a professor of history at Duke University, and she wrote a wonderful book called Soviet Women in Combat, which is about the kind of gender policy of Stalin in the lead up and during the Second World War. It's fascinating, and it shows that although Stalin legally reversed a lot of women's rights, he actually still very much maintained the idea that women and men were equal. And I can't go into that. I'm happy to discuss that in greater depth in the question and answer. You have the in Eastern Europe, and there are some similarities. Basically, the policies that Kollontai had put into place in the Soviet Union in the 1920s sort of make a comeback in the years immediately following the end of the Second World War. So all of the People's Republic constitutions guarantee women's equality with men. They also almost universally mobilize women into the labor force and into male professions. There are women's committees that are formed, and these replace pre-war women's movements. So there's a sort of centralization of women's activism within the state. And there's a lot of state propaganda about the equality of the sexes. I'm going to go into greater detail about this in a second, but I just want to give you sort of a general overview of what happens here. And so some generalizations that I think are really important to understand before we get into the details are that almost all socialist countries, whether they were in Eastern Europe or whether they were in sort of the global South, had several points in common. And most of them had the legal equality between men and women. That was just sort of like a foundational thing that went into the Constitution when she became a socialist country. They invested in women's literacy, education, and training. They almost universally mobilized women into the labor force. You often see a liberalization of divorce. This often has to do with challenges to the church's authority. Interestingly, there's eradication of a distinction between legitimate and illegitimate children. You have state support for single mothers and maternity leaves or parental leaves. You also have the expansion of kindergartens and creches, as well as child allowances. Some countries had newlywed loans. Many countries had, not all, but many countries had pretty progressive sex education. Quite a few countries had liberal abortion policies. And there was a sense of a very treasured private sphere. Now, there were some downsides, and I certainly don't want to give the impression that all of this was like a paradise. I think that's a big, important thing that I do in my book and I do in all my work. I want to say that we should have a realistic assessment of what happened in Eastern Europe, particularly between 1945 and 1990, but that doesn't mean ignoring the downsides, because there were some downsides specifically related to the issue of women. So there were very rigidly fixed gender roles that has to do with this equity versus equality argument. The persistence of patriarchy was pervasive in this part of the world. There was pretty aggressive pronatalism at different periods of time. It took different forms, but in general, women were always imagined as workers and mothers and never just as autonomous individuals, independent of their reproductive functions. There was pervasive homophobia in this part of the world, precisely because of the pronatal politics of many of these countries. There was an incredible double burden of housework and formal employment, which I'll talk about with relation to some policies in a second. There were quote unquote mommy tracks where women who had responsibilities in the home and at work were kind of prevented from getting into high positions of power if they wanted to. There was a general refusal to acknowledge or discuss rape, harassment, sex work, or domestic violence. These were sort of taboo topics in many of these countries. Some countries had very poor quality of service when it came to the kindergartens and the creches, if they even had enough, because many countries didn't have enough kindergarten spaces to keep up with the demand for them. There was gender labor segregation, as there is and there was in many countries. So women tended to do jobs in the light industry, men tended to do jobs in heavy industry, which under communism were better paid. So there were gender wage gaps, although of course those were less important when everybody's basic needs were being met. There were few women in high positions of political authority. There are some very notable exceptions, but in general, they did not achieve as high political power as one would imagine that they would, given all of these policies to help women combine work-family balance issues. And obviously there was a very limited and repressive public sphere with, violations of political rights and travel restrictions, consumer shortages, the pervasive presence of the secret police. So I don't want to deny for a second that there are these really important negatives. But what I'm going to try to do in the remainder of my presentation is really give you a sense of what this looked like on the ground and how it was diverse across the region. So the first thing, this is a table, I'm sorry if the numbers are very small, but this is a table that was produced by the United Nations. I think it was from a book that was published in 1985, and it was about the world's working women. So the numbers here for 2000 are projections, but what you can see here is when you look at labor force participation rates, obviously the USSR and the socialist economies of Eastern Europe were well ahead of the market economies of Europe in 1950, and that's not surprising. So if you look at the Soviet Union, because of the number of men lost in the Second World War, 52% of the labor force was female in 1950, compared to only 30% of the labor force in the market economies of Europe, and about 41% of the labor force in the rest of Eastern Europe. And you can see those numbers gradually increase, but even by 1985, where you've had Western feminism and liberal feminism in the West, in the market economies of Western Europe, you can see that by 1985, the percentage of women in the labor force is still only 34%, compared to 45% in Eastern Europe and about 45% in the USSR. All right, so the one place we can see this very clearly is in East Germany versus West Germany. It's a great case study. I spend a lot of time talking about this in my book, which is you have a country, Germany, which is culturally similar, and the only thing that divides it for 40 years is communism versus capitalism. And of course, in the Federal Republic of Germany, which is West Germany, you had this idea of children, church, children, kitchen, and church, that's where women belonged, taking care of the children, cooking in the kitchen, or praying in the church. You have very, very traditional gender roles. This was true in the United States. It was true in lots of parts of Western Europe as well. Whereas in Eastern Germany, as well as in other socialist countries in Eastern Europe, women were mobilized into the labor force. There was an incredible state propaganda campaign to convince men that women were their equals. There was a big push to increase the socialization of domestic work through precisely the kinds of policies that Alexandra Kollontai had put in place in the Soviet Union in the 20s. Public cafeterias, canteens, mending cooperatives, public laundries, children's homes, kindergartens, creches, and so on. So then we have the Cold War. We have divided Europe between 1945 and 1989, and this is a really important sort of period of time to really think about the way that women's rights gets instantiated through superpower rivalry. Because I argue, not in Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism, but in another book that I wrote called Second World, Second Sex, which is a more academic history of Cold War superpower rivalry around women's rights, that the Cold War, and especially the kind of international confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States, was actually very, very productive and generative for promoting women's rights on the international stage. And I think this is a really important point because, especially in the United States, the narrative of the women's movement is very much a domestic narrative of women sort of standing up and fighting for their rights. But it leaves out the really important international context of the Cold War, which I think has to be brought into the story in order to understand how West European countries and Western countries like the United States went from sort of idealizing women in the home as mothers and homemakers, cooking in the kitchen with their children, to suddenly accepting that women should go into the labor force. That transition happens very quickly, and it happens largely in response to pressure on the international stage from the Eastern Bloc. So just really quickly, this is just a little picture show. I love to look at women's magazines from the United States on the left, and the sample magazine I have here is Ženata Dnes from Bulgaria. And you can see just the representations of women on these magazines. So these are two magazines from the 1950s. You can see on the left, this is sort of a glamorous Western woman, and on the right, you see a woman who's obviously going off to work as a miner or something like that. Similarly, this is also from the 1950s, and you see Vogue on the left. This woman, this very glamorous woman in a car smoking a cigarette with her white gloves. And then you compare that to the women on the cover of Ženata Dnes, who are wearing white lab coats and are obviously working as chemists or science teachers or something like that in the lab, or scientists. It's kind of unclear if they're in a classroom. It looks like they might be in a classroom, but they're obviously learning about science and not really worrying about being glamorous. You can fast forward to the 80s, and again, you have this unique 80s glamour with the big hair on the left from American Cosmopolitan magazine. And on the right, again, you'll have a 1982 edition of Ženata Dnes. This is from April 1982, and it's obviously a nurse. And if you read the little yellow stripe on this slide, it says Leka noš bez mama, which means like good night without mom. So basically, this is an article about women who work night shifts, somebody who's in a hospital taking care of patients, and how do you put your children, how do you get your husband to put your children to bed or create a bedtime ritual for children when the mother is working. All right, again, this is from the 1980s. On the left, you have René Rousseau on the cover of Cosmopolitan, and on the right, or I guess it's my right, I hope it's your right too, you have a February 1984 issue of Ženata Dnes. This is just a smiling woman from a factory. Obviously, she's at work. She's probably won some prize. Again, Cosmopolitan in the 1980s, you can see, and I don't have time to read them, but the little titles on the front of Cosmopolitan are pretty hysterical. Yeah, you're never too young to fib about your age. It can add years to your life. So this is about women staying young and beautiful. And of course, the right is about women. This is obviously a young woman who's working as an architect or some kind of engineer, and she's got a kid, and she's trying to figure out work-family balance issues. This is from 1986, a very different sort of message to women rather than lie about your age and be young. All right, so at this point, there's all sorts of stuff that I could talk about, but I'm going to very specifically take a few minutes to just do a deep dive into some of the policy differences in these different East European countries. One of the biggest misconceptions about life in Eastern Europe before 1989 was that it was homogenous, and that every single country basically took directives from the Soviet Union on domestic policy and implemented whatever it was that the Russians or the Soviets told them to do. In fact, that's not true. And we can see that very clearly when it comes to policies. The two examples that I'm going to give are around abortion and around parental leave policies, because there's an incredible amount of diversity in the Eastern Bloc, depending on where you are. So obviously, the other thing that I just want to say is on this map that you're looking at, the countries that are in dark red, I always have to tell this to my students in the United States because they don't realize that the Soviet Union was everything that was in dark red, and the countries that are in pink were the Eastern Bloc, but they were not part of the Soviet Union. They were independent countries, even though they were obviously within the Soviet sphere of influence. So that means that they had a lot of variety in their domestic policy, particularly with regard to women's issues and family issues. So let's back up now and look at the history of the Soviet Union. And so there was this 1918 family code. I'm not going to go through every single detail here because I could take forever to really talk to you about all of the different changes that were sort of operationalized in the Soviet Union after the Bolshevik Revolution between 1918 and 1936, because there was a 1918 family code, a 1926 family code, a 1936 family code, and then a 1944 family edict. And all during this period of time, Soviet policymakers and women's activists were trying to create policy to combine women's work and family responsibilities, so to keep women in the labor force but not promote a precipitous fall in the birth rate. So prior to 1914, pre-revolutionary Russia, a woman was not allowed to earn a wage, seek an education, or exchange any property without the consent of her husband. Women were completely at the mercy of their husbands, as they were throughout Europe. And there was no such thing as divorce. It was very, very difficult to get a divorce under the Russian Orthodox Church. So when the Bolsheviks come into power, not only do they abolish divorce, as I already mentioned, they also abolish the concept of illegitimacy. They abolish adoption because they believe that the state should care for all children. They allow married couples to take either surname. So essentially they allow women to keep their maiden names if they want to. They also make it so that women can keep their own wages and property in the case of divorce. This was seen as very progressive at the time. And there were some provisions of alimony if one of the spouses was incapacitated or unable to work in the event of a divorce. As I said, in 1920, the USSR becomes the first country in the world to allow first trimester abortions on demand. There's a wonderful film called Bed and Sofa. It's a silent Soviet film from 1927. And the end of that film is a really wonderful scene. You can find it on YouTube, about a Soviet woman going into an abortion clinic in 1927 and waiting to get an abortion. She ultimately does not get it, but the kind of scene and the way that the abortion clinic is presented is really fascinating, given that it's 1927 and it's way before any Western countries are even having a conversation about what it would mean to grant women reproductive freedoms. So the 1926 Family Code tries to rectify some of the problems in the 1918 Family Code, because there were all sorts of problems that occurred. There was an increasing number of abandoned children. Many men were abandoning their wives with the liberalization of divorce. Essentially, once a woman got pregnant, their husbands would take off. But also the reality of the First World War, and then the Soviet Civil War. And then, of course, there was a famine in 1921 that contributed to a lot of men just dying, or a lot of women being unable to take care of their children. And so there are some policy changes that are put into place to try to get men to be more responsible. And like I said, I could go into all sorts of details about this, but it was a really interesting attempt to recognize something like common law marriage, what they call de facto marriage. They also instituted policies that allowed for collective paternity, whereby several men could be responsible for the same child. And they also reinstated the legal possibility for adoption once they realized that there were so many abandoned children that the state could not afford to care for. So 1936, as I said, Stalin reversed many of the progressive policies that were put into place in the 20s, largely because he was very worried about the falling birth rate, and because he was totally convinced that the Germans were going to invade, or that the Western capitalist countries were going to invade the Soviet Union, and he wanted to be prepared for a war. So he also institutes these new child encouragement policies. So there are the introduction of job protected pregnancy leaves, childcare services, payments for large families. They make it difficult not only to get an abortion with severe fines and jail time, but also very difficult to get a divorce. And there are also very harsh penalties for men who fail to pay their alimony or child support. Things get even worse in the 1944 Family Edict. I'm not going to go into any detail here, but the key thing is that they make it much harder to get divorced, but they're also really trying to support women's productive and reproductive labor. So the idea that people will be home and not be home, but will be having babies, but also be continuing to work, because of course, Stalin is very concerned about the population, especially during the war. All right, 1955, after Stalin's death, abortion becomes legal for medical reasons. There is the reliberalization of divorce. In 1968, all abortions are liberalized. It's a very liberal policy. And in 1969, a woman named Natalia Baranskaya publishes a very important novella called Week Like Any Other in Novi Mir. And in this, she talks about sort of the challenges of being a working Soviet mother and having full childcare responsibilities as well as a job. And the idea is that the Soviet state needs to increase the amount of resources that are being funneled to policies like child allowances, job protected maternity leaves, and kindergartens and creches. All right, This is a really interesting little fact, which is the 1961, there was an article that was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA, which is the premier American medical journal. And it was called Abortion in Eastern Europe. And it was essentially an article that said the liberalization of abortion in Eastern Europe, they actually had good data now on this, was showing that maternal mortality was declining. And essentially what the authors did was say, look, you know, getting an abortion is way safer than giving birth to a child. And this is really important because by the 1950s, by the early 1960s in the Soviet Union, the number of abortions was actually higher than the number of live births. So they had really good data. And these were just doctors sort of talking about what the implications of abortion on demand in the first trimester would be. And then you have this letter on the right-hand side of my screen to the editor, where this doctor basically says, this is an abomination. How can you possibly be talking about something like abortion neutrally? And it's at this moment that the evangelical Christian population, for instance, in the United States, suddenly takes up their kind of crusade against abortion, because prior to that, they had not been against abortion in the United States, but they become so once it becomes very clearly associated with communism in Eastern Europe. This is a 1976 article review looking at abortion policies in Eastern Europe. This is from a British magazine. I think what's really important here is, again, that Western feminists start to hear about what's going on in the Eastern Bloc, and they're like, hey, wait, why can women in the Soviet Union, which is a not free country, have reproductive decisions over their bodies, and women in the United States cannot? So there starts to be this kind of conversation that's going on internationally. And one of my favorite stories happens to do with Poland. So Poland is a really interesting case because between 1945 and 1956, abortion was legal for medical reasons, and if the pregnancy resulted from a crime such as rape or incest. And then between 1956 and 1990, the communist period, Poland had a very liberal abortion law, which made it legal for difficult living conditions. So that meant, like, if your apartment was too small, or if your wages weren't high, or if you just didn't think you could have room for another child in your family. And then, as I'm sure many of you know, all of these communist era laws were reversed after the fall of communism, and the Catholic Church begins to have a bigger influence in the Polish society and the Polish government. And so now Poland has one of the most restrictive abortion laws within the European Union. But here's the great story. This was called the Poland Affair, and this is a little article that was written about in 1964 in Sweden. There was a conference about what women did when they got pregnant, and there were these two women who had gotten pregnant and they didn't want to have babies. But anyway, the end of the story, there's a short version of the story, it's a great little article, is that one of the women actually in Sweden traveled to communist Poland to have an abortion. And she told this story at the conference, and suddenly there was like a rush of women, Swedish women, who started going or wanted to get information about going to Poland, to communist Poland, to be able to terminate their pregnancies. And it was the option of being able to go to Poland that eventually ends up liberalizing abortion in Sweden. So the Swedish abortion law, which it's a fairly liberal law, but it really, if you look back at the deep history of this law in social democratic Sweden, it's because of the existence of a very liberal abortion policy in communist Poland during that period of time. It's a story that very few people know about, and I think it's a really interesting example of how Cold War rivalry between the East and West ends up influencing policies around women's rights. So obviously the negative case here is Romania, and I'm sure many of you have heard about Romania. Abortion was legal on demand in 1957, but after 1966 with Decree 770, Ceausescu makes abortion extremely restrictive and also outlaws birth control. And it's a terribly repressive regime around reproductive rights. They essentially nationalize women's wombs. It turns out that then Romania has the highest maternal mortality rate in Europe because of this policy, because so many women go underground, as I'm sure you know, to have illegal abortions. And so they are a kind of a negative example of what could happen under a communist country. And one of the first things that happens, the complete reverse of what happened in Poland, is that after the fall of communism, the Romanians liberalized abortion. Albania is another really interesting case. Albania had a total ban on abortion unless the woman's life was in danger. During the communist period, they did not believe in abortion. There were many, many illegal abortions, which meant that they had the second highest maternal mortality rate in Europe after Romania. And again, in 1989, abortion becomes legal in the case of rape and incest, and if the patient is under the age of 16. And then by 1995, after the communist era, one of the things that happens in Albania is that you have a liberalized first trimester abortion policy. Bulgaria is sort of a middle case. They had a very liberal policy, then they moved to a slightly more restrictive policy, and then they go back to a very liberal policy. And that had to do with sort of the fact that they were in conversation or in dialogue with what was going on in Romania, their neighbor directly to the north. Czechoslovakia also had a pretty liberal policy, then tried to put some restrictions on. The restrictions were almost largely put in place in the late 1960s to deal with falling birth rates, the demographic collapse. It had very little to do with, outside of Poland, with religious issues. It had much more to do with the demographic issues. But then again, in 1986, before the end of the communist period in Czechoslovakia, the liberalization of divorce happened. In Germany, it was a complete chaos with reunification, because on the one hand, you had the West Germans with a fairly restrictive abortion law, and you had the East Germans with a fairly liberal abortion law. And then with the reunification of Germany in 1990, they had to try to reconcile those. It was a very complicated thing. It almost scuttled the possibility of German reunification. So there were lots of stuff going on there. Now, in the interest of time, I had actually hoped to talk a lot, to give you a bunch of examples of different parental leave policies. This is my kind of professorial mode. I like to get into the details. I don't want to get into generalizations, because I feel like when we generalize, people are always saying, well, you know, you're not really grounded in the research and the reality. But the great thing about Eastern Europe is that we can actually look at their legal codes. So, you know, we don't actually we can actually see what was on paper, what were the kinds of policies that they implemented. And the key thing about Eastern Europe that I want to say is that they were very, very liberal very early and very generous when it came to parental leave. So Bulgaria was one of the first. It had a very, very, very generous parental leave policy. These are paid, job-protected parental leave policies, as well as child allowances and guaranteed spaces in creches and kindergartens. And that means that a woman could leave the labor force for up to 2 years. Her job would be guaranteed. She would be paid for the first year, generally at her wage, for the second year at the legally mandated domestic minimum wage. And then there was a potential of taking perhaps a third year at unpaid. But the key thing in the Bulgarian case was that the time out of the labor force counted as labor force participation for the purposes of pensions, for vesting in pensions later. Germany had East Germany had an incredible set of policies in place to support working mothers. And by 1981, 61% of all children under the age of 3 were in creches, which these are like nurseries, and 95% of all children between the ages of 3 and 7 were in kindergartens, which is an incredible number. And even so, like that extra 5% of kids that weren't, there was still a really high demand for these spaces. For the most part, in Eastern Germany, the kindergartens were pretty high quality, and they were everywhere. They were well funded, and most children used them. Now, this is also a slide from Josie McClellan's book, Love in the Time of Communism. Again, a book I highly recommend if you're interested in learning more about the history of socialism, and especially sex and socialism in Eastern Europe. This is a list of very specific policies between 1950 and 1986 that you can see that were implemented in Eastern Germany to support women. And this is a slide about Hungary. again, the thing that's really interesting is that Hungary took a very different perspective on this issue, and they really wanted women to stay home with their children when their children were young rather than putting them into kindergarten. So this is a communist country that took a very different path, and you can see by 1980, only 10% of children under the age of 3 were in creches. So this is a much smaller percentage than East Germany. So this shows you the kind of diversity of the bloc. The USSR, interestingly, was rather late to the party on this one. The Bulgarians and the East Germans and the Hungarians were much earlier. And so it's only in 1981 that the Soviet Union really gets a generous maternity leave policy or parental leave policy, and starts trying to implement policies to make it easier for women to combine their work and family. But you can see here by 1976, the creches and the kindergartens only covered about 40% of Soviet children because grandmothers who retired fairly early at 55 did most of the work. And so some countries had universal kindergarten coverage, some countries wanted women to stay home, some mothers to stay home, some countries wanted grandmothers to stay home. Later on in the communist period, there starts to be some move to try to get fathers to stay home, or at least to give fathers the opportunity to stay home. As you can imagine, it doesn't work very well, partially because of what I said earlier. Patriarchy persists in this part of the world. So 1989, I'm just going to really quickly try to blast through these last slides because this is the kind of more contemporary stuff. So what are the legacies of these policies? And as I said, I'm perfectly happy to answer any questions about the details. I can see there are a lot of questions up there about the details of these policies in Eastern Europe. What are the legacies today? Well, one of the legacies today, not surprisingly, is that Eastern Europe leads the developed world in female doctors. Eastern Europe also has the highest percentage of women working in the tech sector. So especially countries like Lithuania, Bulgaria, Latvia, when you look at the EU average of about 32%, many East European countries are well above the average. When you look at absolute percentages, Bulgaria, it's about 30% of women working in tech. Ireland, you can see there, is about 19%, which is still pretty good, but not nearly as good as places like Bulgaria and Romania. This is The Economist, not exactly a pro-socialist publication. And this was just from last year, called Why Half of the Scientists in Some East European Countries Are Women. The Soviet Legacy is Part of the Reason. So here's The Economist basically admitting, like, hey, there's some real evidence to show that these policies of promoting women into the labor force, and especially putting them into fields that were previously male dominated, like engineering, has these downstream payoffs. I give you some figures here about the percentages of women that were graduating with degrees in engineering. Huge numbers compared to, in 1976, only 3.4% of bachelor's degrees in engineering in the United States were going to women. This is another really important paper from May 2018. Anybody who's interested in this, I highly recommend you read it. It's freely available online. It's called Girls, Math, and Socialism, and it's about the gender gap in math performance on a standardized test that is given across Europe. And it shows, perhaps not surprisingly, that women, young girls who were raised in previously socialist countries, do much better, or there's a less of a gender gap between men and women than girls that are raised in previous or continuingly capitalist countries. So finally, why is this so important? Well, the reason it's so important is because we haven't fixed any of these problems. Like Flora Tristan was writing about all of this stuff in 1840, and it's 2020, and we are still grappling with many of the same issues that Flora Tristan and Bebel and Kollontai and Zetkin and Braun were complaining about in the 19th century. So, especially from where I'm sitting, if we look at maternity leave, there are policies for maternity leave. It turns out that Ireland is not too bad with 42 weeks. But if we look at the United States, where I'm sitting, we get 0. There are 0, 0, 0, 0 hours or days or weeks or months or years of federally mandated maternity leave in the United States. It is only a benefit if your employer gives it to you. And so the best we can do in this country is the FMLA policies, which is 12 weeks of unpaid leave if you have to if you're having a baby or you're taking care of an ill relative, and it's unpaid. And there's not necessarily a guarantee that your job will be there, although it should be when you leave. Sometimes it happens that you don't get your job back. So you can see that the United States does terrible on this parental leave policy. Australia and the UK do pretty poorly too. Not surprisingly, places like Estonia and Hungary are at the top of the list. We also know very clearly, we have data from the World Economic Forum about the gender gap, and they rank countries based on the difficulty that women have in reaching equity or parity with men. And not surprisingly, you know, we have to ask ourselves, why does the gender gap persist? We've had all of these years of feminism, liberal feminism, and there's been there's been so much progress in terms of women's education, women's entry into the labor force, but why do these gender gaps persist? And of course, the reason they persist is precisely because of this perception that women have responsibility for care work. And what we know is that unpaid care work is 2 to 10 times more likely to be done by women. On March 5th, just before this whole crazy coronavirus stuff happened, I wrote an op-ed with Gus Veserick of the New York Times called "Women's Unpaid Labor is Worth $10.9 Trillion." And this was basically looking at why it was that these gender pay gaps still exist. And what we find, not surprisingly, is that countries with robust welfare programs have higher gender parity because capitalism is being less subsidized by women's unpaid labor in the home. We can look very specifically at the OECD data on women's paid and unpaid work. And we see, I pulled out the Irish statistics here. So this is time spent on unpaid labor in the home. You can see that men in Ireland spend 129 minutes per day, just a little over 2 hours on unpaid labor. And this includes all, domestic chores or domestic work or whatever that would fall into this category of paid labor. And women spend 296 minutes per day. And if we value that, using the minimum wage for Ireland, that means that for 2018 purchasing price parity, Irish women supported the Irish economy by $31.5 billion annually with their unpaid labor compared to men. Now, this is a very conservative estimate because we're looking at minimum wages. We're also, this data from the Oxfam report doesn't take into account the gender imbalance in unpaid labor. It's just looking at the total unpaid labor and dividing it by the population of men and women. So this is a very conservative estimate of the amount of labor that women contribute to the Irish economy. And we can do these statistics for the United States. It's $1.5 trillion that women contribute. So, not surprisingly, we come back to austerity. And in this sort of historical moment that we're in, we really need to think about the kinds of cuts that governments are going to try to rush through after this whole coronavirus pandemic is over, or even before so. And the key thing, the takeaway from this, and this is the takeaway that I promote and I talk a lot about in my book, is that when governments implement austerity policies and they slash public spending, there are always cuts to public services, especially to pensions, childcare, and healthcare. But the need for the care for children, the elderly, and the infirm does not disappear. What happens is it gets shoved into the home where mostly women must now provide it for free. And I think that this is really important to understand because strong state-funded social safety nets, whoops, I didn't mean to do that, are good for everyone in society, but particularly good for those with care work responsibilities or social expectations that they will provide care in the future. So when you live in a culture or society where women are the ones who are primarily responsible for caring for the sick, for the elderly, for the infirm, for children, they're the ones who are going to be most affected by any cuts to the social safety net. And I think that the coronavirus has made this more clear than ever before. It's women who are doing the vast majority of homeschooling. It's women who are doing the vast majority of care work. It's become very, very obvious that we still live in incredibly gender unequal societies. And I think that one of the reasons that despite all of these years of liberal feminism is that we haven't really dealt with the underlying relationship between care work and capitalism, which is something that we really, really need to still address. And so I'll just end there. I'm happy to take your questions. I love this meme. One of my students sent it to me. This is one of the reasons why I think young people are incredibly, especially in my country, in the United States, attracted to the ideals of socialism right now. And it's precisely because they understand that the world that we're living in, with the challenges of the 21st century, automation and climate change and extreme income inequality, these are all problems that the market cannot solve. And in fact, in many ways, the market makes them worse. So the only way to really tackle the challenges of the 21st century is to start thinking creatively about the ideals of socialism and disengaging them from the baggage of 20th century state socialism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. I definitely don't want to ignore the negatives of those regimes, but I think it's really important to go in and think about the nuances of what they tried to do. And they got some things right. And I argue that one of the things that they got right is women's rights and policies around the socialization of domestic work. So I'll stop there and take your questions.
Okay, that's great. Thanks a million, Kristen. Really appreciate it. So we have maybe about 20 minutes or so for questions.